and to Schiffer Books, our publisher. So what we're going to do is Rob and I are going to ask each other a few questions, and then I'm going to read a section from the book, and then Rob's going to talk about a few of his amazing illustrations, and then you guys get to ask questions. So I think first, Rob, you can ask me a question starting out.
Okay. Well, we did it again. It's a good read, and on top of that, I think it's pretty. It's one of the prettiest ones.
It is.
You'll get to see more in a little bit.
Here it is.
So would you just like to kind of go big picture where the idea came from?
Yeah.
Go for it.
Okay, so the book, this is the third, like Margaret said, in a series called The President and Me. It's a middle grade fiction series for kids, but a lot of adults have also read it and enjoyed it. So I've been going in order with the presidents. So we started with George Washington, then we moved to John Adams, and now Thomas Jefferson. I have always been really interested in history, and I have always loved children's books. And so I thought this was a good way to combine my interest in the two. And I thought that it would be fun to have this magical element to the books. So there's really three parts to these books. There's the fact that there's a group of fifth graders. So they're the present day characters. They live in Bethesda, Maryland, and they go to an elementary school that's very similar to Westbrook Elementary in Bethesda, where my son went. And they have, in addition to their magical adventures, they have regular, everyday fifth grade lives in the 21st century. So in book one, which is George Washington and the Magic Hat, I have my props here. Here's the hat. George Washington and the Magic Hat. My character Sam goes to Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, on a school field trip and ends up buying a magic hat. He doesn't know it's magic. It's a tri-cornered hat like the ones that colonists wore. And it ends up talking and having kind of this crotchety personality. And it's actually from the times back then in the 18th century. So he ends up traveling back and forth, meeting George Washington at different points along the way. But he's also dealing with some issues in the present day. So he's a good actor, but he didn't get the lead role as George Washington in his school play. And he's not talking to his best friend anymore. So so there's this blend of the present day and the past and the magic. So there's sort of three parts. Book two, John Adams and the Magic Bobblehead. We actually have this lovely John Adams bobblehead. And my character Ava ends up going back to meet John and Abigail Adams and their kids, and while also dealing with her newly blended family and her annoying younger stepbrother. So what happens is, like in each of these books, the characters appear in the other books, but at each one it's told from a different kid's perspective. So moving on to our new book, our main character in this book is named Oliver, and he appears in the two earlier books. He's the new kid in town, basically. He moved from New Jersey to Maryland at the end of 4th grade. He's incredibly smart. He doesn't have the greatest social skills, and he's having kind of a hard time making new friends. So that's what's going on with Oliver. It's Sam, who he's sort of friendly with, lends him the magic hat, and it takes him back to meet Thomas Jefferson and Madison Hemings, who's another very interesting character, who was Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings' son. So there's also a cameo appearance by Alexander Hamilton. So in the room where it happened, at the dinner. So I had to put that in. But anyway, so that's kind of the broad picture on the books. So I wanted to actually turn back to Rob now and ask him. The illustrations for these books are incredible. And I wanted to say that I've actually known Rob and his wife Kathleen since I was in 5th grade. So we go back a long time. And I wanted to just ask you, Rob, how did you come up with this incredible style for the illustrations of these books?
Well, I'll call it evolution. If you put the books side by side, you'll see that the George Washington's book is sort of uses a caricature style, not cartoon, but a caricature. And as the books have gone along, they've gotten really tighter. My son calls it now imaginative realism. This style sort of started. Our newspaper did a weekly chapter of a story for their newspaper and education program, and then their questions would come, and then they would also sell some newspapers to the schools to be a part of the newspaper and education. In that case, the writer one weekend pulled out made a character for everybody, invited them to their house, and set up poses and scenes, and we just took pictures, and all I had to do was make a drawing from those. Of course, I had to add a background, but that was really a treat. But they were a little tight. I mean, so after later on at the newspaper, I started doing an occasional news courtroom drawing. So the newer style that really is a takeoff on the newspaper and education style. The newer style has a little swish and a squiggle here and there, like a courtroom drawing. So I just try to work somewhere in between. Nothing wrong with courtroom drawing, but it sure is a pleasure to have these pictures that hold still for you. Now, one thing we wanted to talk about, and it's in the news this week, poor old Jefferson is still having a hard time. He got in trouble again somewhere as a statue, I believe. So you want to talk about the timely issues of the book, how things are going.
Yes, no, thank you. That's a really important question. I think these books, especially this one, are very timely because to get into the broader series, I mean, presidents are certainly in the news and in a major way. And I think that it's always good to go back to earlier presidents and look at them and how they handled different issues. The election 200 years ago, actually between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, was the first really contested election among people from different parties at the time. It was a very nasty election. The two sides were very, very, very condemnatory toward each other. And it ended up being decided in the House of Representatives. So we're kind of dealing with a contentious election situation right now. Specifically with Thomas Jefferson, I was actually doing a written interview with another book blogger recently, and she asked me, like, did I ever have second thoughts about writing about Jefferson, given that there are a lot of controversies right now, and with George Washington too. I mean, with statues, should they be up? Should they be taken down? Should things be renamed? Buildings be renamed if they had, because they were slaveholders? And the country's going through a real racial reckoning right now. And the question is looming out there. And I was very interested in writing about Jefferson. And, we started on this book, I guess, a couple of years ago. And the book does mention Charlottesville because the characters go to Charlottesville to visit Monticello and visit UVA. And I put in a reference to that. I don't want these books to be tied to a specific year in the present because the characters are always in 5th grade. And you know, these books have been coming out now for several years. So I don't want it to be like, okay, these books take place in 2018 or something like that. But, you know, I did throw in a reference to Charlottesville because I think that's very important. I knew that I wanted to include Madison Hemings, who I mentioned earlier, as one of the main characters. What happens in these books is the kids go back and forth. They go back to the 18th and 19th centuries, and they meet up with various people connected to that president. So it's not always the president. I mean, with the John Adams book, sometimes it was Abigail, sometimes it was their kids. In this case, you know, Oliver does meet Thomas Jefferson at various points, including when he's writing the Declaration of Independence, but he also meets Madison Hemings. Now, Madison Hemings was a very interesting character. He was one of the children of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. So Jefferson had a family with his wife. He also had a family with Sally Hemings, who was an enslaved woman at Monticello. Madison was one of the kids from the two of them. He did win his freedom along with his siblings at a later point as adults. Sally Hemings never was given her freedom. So for her whole life, she was enslaved. Madison Hemings, as an older man, wrote a short memoir about growing up at Monticello, about his family, about what it was like to be growing up as an enslaved person at a plantation that your father owned. It is just an incredible historical artifact, and I think that, and it's in, I mentioned it in the book, Oliver, who's very into learning and studying and researching things, he looks up the memoir, so it's mentioned in there. But I have several scenes in the book where he meets Madison Hemings at different points along the way at Monticello. And I felt like that was a very important aspect of Jefferson's life to approach in the book. One thing is that, you know, in both the George Washington book and this book, the present day characters explore the issue of how can these people who are the founding fathers of the country, and in Jefferson's case wrote the Declaration of Independence, have owned other people, and especially in Jefferson's case, people who were his children. So that's something these present day characters are trying to grapple with. The books, I did do a lot of research for the books, and I don't, like this other book blogger was asking me like, why I didn't like answer the question or have the Jefferson character actually answer the question of why he did that. And it's because he never really could answer it. And so I have him say things that were things that he said or that approximated what he said, but I really leave it to the present day characters to think about how that could have been possible, and hopefully for readers of the book to explore that further and look into it and think about it. So again, these books do have very timely elements to them. I want to just say also that, you know, they explore serious topics like slavery, like the Revolutionary War, but they also have a lot of humor in them. So I want to point that out too, that, you know, we try to put humorous aspects both in the text and in the illustrations. And so there's a blend between the two, which we hope we got that right. So yeah, so I would say, yeah, they have a lot of timely elements, especially this latest book. And I would encourage readers to go out and find out more if you're curious. So Rob, I wanted to ask you now another question. How did you choose the scenes that you decided to illustrate? Like, how did you pick out, oh, that would make a good scene to illustrate for the book?
Well, I read the book and I read the book and I read the book. And sometimes I even read the book with a sketch pad in the other hand, making little thumbnails or writing notes on and on and on. I have to learn the characters, and I want to make sure that I take the main characters and you get some notion of how they look. I'll probably make a page of thumbnails, a storyboard like that. And after that, after I get close on the storyboard, I go to the index cards. I think you can see a few back here. I believe at one point in the beginning on Jefferson, I had about 23 scenes pulled. And actually, once I put them on index cards, I made more index cards, but way too many pictures. So you just have to kind of get it down to what you would call pivotal scenes. Make sure you get to meet the main characters, and you can follow a little bit of the story going through the book. It's not supposed to be a graphic novel, the old classic comic. So much of what I do, I also hope just inspires your imagination. You see Oliver doing this, and you know what you don't have to see every move Oliver makes. I think a real good example of leaving things up to your imagination was, what's her name? Mrs. Martin, the school teacher. Now, I could have tried to draw Mrs. Martin, but we've all had these elementary school teachers that made a mark on us. Yeah. And I wanted people to read your description of Mrs. Martin and then say, hey, she's just like so-and-so. Yeah. And that's better than my depiction could be. Now, in the end, back to the index cards and the scenes, some of the scenes, like I believe in the beginning of the book, there's a sign that says Monticello with an arrow. Well, that started out as a car driving up a hill with trees and all that. But you go through and take some of these 23 or so scenes and turn them into just a little thumbnail, just to break up type a little bit on a page. I don't mean to downplay them and say they just break up type, but anyway.
Yeah.
That's the way it goes. Process. Start with a lot and pull some and try to choose the important ones.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and you do an incredible job. I mean, the books, like Rob said, they're not graphic novels, but they have just enough illustrations in them. Like every chapter has a few illustrations. Some are bigger and some are smaller, and they just add so much to the book. Like you're looking through and it just brings it to life. So I thought what I would do right now is read a tiny little bit from chapter 1 of the book. So where we are in the book at this point is Oliver has gone to Monticello with his family. And his family includes his parents and his 2 older sisters. Cassie is the oldest. She's a senior in high school, and she and the mom are actually off visiting UVA. So that leaves the father, Oliver, and his next sister, Ruby. Okay, now Oliver gets along great with Cassie. He does not get along with Ruby at all. So Ruby is in 9th grade. She's an aspiring journalist. She wants to know everything that's going on. She's very blunt, and she says things to Oliver that he does not want to hear. And they have a very difficult sibling relationship. Also along on this trip to Monticello is Sam, because Ruby thought that Sam might be a good friend for Oliver because she feels like Oliver has no social skills, so she has to help him. So at this point, it's like their dad, Ruby, Oliver, and Sam. So Oliver and Sam know that the hat has magical qualities. They do not want Ruby to figure that out because they feel like Ruby is going to write it in some newspaper that she works for, and everyone's going to find out, and Sam wants to keep the whole thing quiet. So this is kind of where we are. Okay, so the hat is there, and the hat is about to jump into its magic for the first time in this book. Okay, so I'll show you, the hat said, and suddenly Oliver felt a dizzy feeling sweep over him, sort of like what had happened when he and Sam went back in time to the crossing of the Delaware, where he had met George Washington. Was it about to happen again? He closed his eyes. He might as well just go with it, whatever was happening. He could see her here screaming. It sounded like Ruby. He opened his eyes to find himself on a mountaintop. There was no sign of Monticello or of the lines of people waiting to take the tour. But there was Sam, and there was Ruby. Help, she was screaming. Her eyes were practically bulging out of her head. What the? Help! Alls, what the? Where are we? What's going on? Where's Dad? Where's Monticello? Oh my God. Oliver couldn't help grinning. This was kind of fun. Sam, though, who had the hat firmly perched on his head, was looking worried. I'm not sure it's such a great idea for your sister to know about the hat, he whispered to Oliver. She won't keep it quiet. Oliver nodded. He was concerned about that too, but it was almost worth it to see Ruby so upset. And then a couple of teenage boys rode up on their horses. They were wearing strange clothes, pants that ended at the knees with socks, vests over long-sleeved shirts with weird ruffled collars. One boy had reddish hair, which was pulled back in a ponytail of sorts. As their horses slowed, they stared at Oliver, Sam, and Ruby, who was trying to calm herself down. So here's Rob's picture of that scene. Okay, Ruby was saying to herself, okay, there's some explanation for this. I know there has to be. She took a series of deep breaths. Dabney, perhaps they are lost, the red-haired boy said, bringing his horse to a stop. They have no horses. Are you well? The other boy asked, also stopping and looking at Ruby with concern. I do hope you haven't taken sick or perhaps been startled at the sight of us. And he smiled at Ruby. Ruby glared at Oliver before tossing her hair around and smiling at both of the teenage boys. Oliver supposed she must be practicing her social skills on them. Oh, no, I'm fine, she said, but it's kind of you to ask. Oliver and Sam exchanged glances. Could the red-haired boy possibly be Thomas Jefferson as a teenager? And who was Dabney? Oliver thought back. He remembered that as a teenager, Thomas Jefferson had had a good friend who had ended up marrying one of Thomas Jefferson's sisters. Perhaps that was Dabney? We seem to have forgotten our manners, Dabney said. I'm Dabney Carr, and my somewhat shy friend is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, Ruby said. She stared at the two of them, and then back at Oliver and Sam, and at the hat. Oliver could see that she was starting to put everything together. Her eyes narrowed. Thomas Jefferson, she said again. Well, okay then, and Dabney Carr. Nice to meet you both. I'm Ruby, and this is my brother Oliver and his friend Sam. A pleasure, Thomas Jefferson said. Isn't this a beautiful spot, Dabney Carr said, gesturing expansively around him. This wonderful mountain. Tom and I have decided that when one of us dies, one hopes a long time from now, the other one will bury him here. At Monticello, Ruby asked. Here? Monticello, Thomas Jefferson said, a faraway look in his eye. What a perfect name. Little Mountain. Ruby tossed her hair again. Yes, quite perfect, she said. She smiled at both of the other teenagers. Ugh, Oliver thought. She was such a phony. She never smiled at Oliver, except when she had gotten the better of him in one of their arguments. Both Thomas Jefferson and Dabney Carr smiled back at her. This was getting kind of annoying, Oliver thought, like they were at an 18th century version of a high school dance or something. Why did the hat have to bring Ruby along anyway? So that is from chapter 1, the first adventure that they have in this book where they go back in time. So I thought now Rob could show a couple of the illustrations that he especially likes.
Well, I thought I'd show the process, a little bit about that. You know, you and I are sort of running out of fifth graders. It gets tougher every time.
It does.
Here is the way the cover started. Okay, that's pretty good. But you'll see that this is my wife Kathleen's arm. This is a statue. Jefferson's head came from a statue, I believe, at Monticello, maybe in the Capitol in Washington. A clip art feather. The body here is from a child's clothing ad. This is my nephew, who is the face of Oliver, and a clip art hat on top. And then I believe these are some newspapers here to represent the Declaration. So that's really the way it happens. This is the cover, and I could show you a cover if I had one handy, but there you go. I do want to thank the Schiffer people for making some suggestions that truly improve the illustration. I had some silhouettes before, and I really like that better. It is, in fact, my favorite cover of the three. Yeah. Another a good example of how the process goes is this is where Oliver gets home one night, and he just collapses on the bed. He is so tired. Well, my sister-in-law came by, and when I was working on this one, so let's see, we put a hoodie on her, and she collapsed on our sofa, and I had a picture of her son Sam, who plays Oliver, in some sort of school play, and in the end, this is the bag that the hat stays in. I took a piece of a quilt from an ad somewhere, and that's
I'm showing the illustration.
Okay,
yeah.
This is the drawing. Now, once the drawings are done on a desk with pen and ink, the gray and the wash, and it comes from, I'll admit it, Photoshop. I scan them into the computer and use Photoshop brushes. It is such a treat not to spend all afternoon on a drawing and then get out the watercolors and ruin it. So, blessed Photoshop. These are tough times for finding models, and we are working on a fourth book. Everybody wants to keep their distance. So Kathleen is having to sort of work overtime. We have a scene where, what's his name, Paul, who rescued the Gilbert Stuart portrait. Okay, the British are coming. Yeah. He's rescuing the portrait. So here is Kathleen rescuing corrugated cardboard and duct tape from the backyard. And then we paste Paul's face on that and paste the Stuart portrait. And here is, in fact, the drawing.
Oh, wow.
Before it gets the final wash layer.
That's great.
All right.
Okay. So, I think we can get some questions from everybody if they have questions. Margaret, you're muted, I think.
Thank you for reminding me that I needed to turn my microphone on. Sorry about that, folks. And thank you, Rob and Deborah, for such an engaging presentation. We do have some great audience questions, and I wanted to start in and get to some of them. I have one first for Deborah and then one for Rob. This one is from Martha. Deborah, how do you avoid the rabbit hole of research that is, how do you know when it's time to quit and focus on writing?
That's such a good question. I mean, I think that I'm helped in that in part because of having been working in journalism for a long time, that I kind of have a sense, okay, now I need to just get going with my writing. But yeah, it's very tempting to just keep looking things up all the time because you find out, I mean, Thomas Jefferson, the Monticello website has fascinating things that I could just end up like going from one page to another and the link goes to something else that's interesting and something else. What ends up happening with anything that I'm writing is that I start coming across the same things that I already know. And that's my signal goes off in my head that, okay, you know, I'm coming to the end of the research phase and I'm moving into the writing phase. And I remember having that same feeling when I'd be doing a piece as a journalist, the same kind of thing. Like once I started hearing the same thing from 7 different people that I already knew, I'd say, okay, I think it's time to write. So it's the same kind of process. It is very tempting though to keep on reading and reading and researching because there's a lot of books. I mean, I could have read, you know, 20 more books about Thomas Jefferson. There certainly are a lot of amazing books out there about him. But I tend to read a combination of books for kids and books for adults about these presidents, if there are books for kids about them. And because I want to sort of get a feel for what other writers have written for kids about them and sort of get a feel for that. And once I kind of have hit on sort of these are the main points, I do more research into, as I'm writing actually, on specific things. Like like in the first book, Sam goes to George Washington's inauguration as the first president. And I remember I'm like, okay, now I need to have a much better picture in my mind of what the building looks like, of whether how he could go into the building and find George Washington. And so as I'm writing, I do a lot of additional research, realizing that I need details on particular aspects of what I'm writing about. But I do reach a certain point where I'm like, time to write now. So.
Well, that was a good question, even for me.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Finally, somebody has to tell me to sit down and draw. Enough research, draw. Okay.
Well, that actually segues into this question for you, Rob, from Andy. He wants to know, for the aspiring young artists, what are your recommendations to follow in the footsteps of an accomplished illustrator such as yourself?
Wow. I just got lucky. I mean, the first thing you do is you draw and you look at other people's illustrations and you look at illustration books and magazines. And I mean, I started drawing when I was 6 years old. As long as I can remember, I had a pencil and something to draw. And gosh, I don't know if this is answering the question, but when I got my first magic marker in the 6th grade, I was drawing pictures for kids' t-shirts. Pictures of cars and monsters on t-shirts, and you just keep drawing. You just keep drawing, and that's how you get started. Hopefully somebody sees it. I got lucky.
That's great. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask a question. Judith asks, and I think it's a question from 11-year-old, she says, what inspired you to start writing these books about the presidents?
Okay, so I think I might know whose question this is, so thank you for the question. I think that you're well on your way to being an amazing writer yourself. You already are an amazing writer. I mean, you are incredible. So anyway, I think that the idea was actually, I had written about presidents for some reference books that I worked on. And then my father and I wrote the book Haunting Legacy, which also deals with presidents, although much more recent presidents, as far as how they dealt with the aftermath of the Vietnam War. And it probably was my mother actually back, maybe 6 years ago or so now, who said, why don't you write something about presidents for kids? And I thought about it. I was like, that's a great idea. And I think she had meant something nonfiction. But I was kind of looking around. I'm like, there's so many nonfiction books. I want to do something different. And I've always wanted to write fiction. And I've attempted to write fiction. And I have all kinds of manuscripts and drawers that I take out every decade or so and revise. But these came out of the idea that of a love for writing fiction. I think that I wanted to do something a little different. And one role model for me are these books that I read as a kid, the Half Magic series by Edward Eger. I don't know how many of you might have read those, but they're books that came out in the 50s and 60s, and they involved these magic adventures that these kids had, but they also had a very grounded life in their present day as well. And I sort of saw that as a way of approaching this and having the kids each have their adventures, but also be brought back to the present and really have a feeling of both aspects of the book going on. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. We have a question from Denise Holmes. First, a comment. She says, thanks so much for these terrific books my children and I have enjoyed so. I remember early on you said that you would not necessarily go in order of the presidents. Can you share who might be the next one you cover and when you might cover one from the 20th century?
Thank you, Denise. That's a great question. I mean, for now, we're going in order. So the fourth one that Rob and I are at work on is about James Madison, and we're hoping that that will see the light of day at some point in the not so distant future. And I have an idea of the first 6 presidents. Then who knows? I know that I do not want to write about the current president. I don't think that that would be something that I would want to deal with. And I don't think it would be the same type of book that would be like an appropriate book for kids. So as far as other presidents, Lincoln maybe, Teddy Roosevelt, I mean, that would get you into the 20th century. FDR, I mean, I think there's a lot of presidents, but I'll tell you, I recently read for a book that I'm in, this book about James Garfield, and it's this for adults. I mean, it's this fascinating book about the assassination of James Garfield, and it makes me stop and think, well, you know, there was a lot to learn about James Garfield. I mean, he was actually an incredibly interesting figure. You just don't really know that much about him because he was the president for less than a year and then he was killed. But I mean, from the book that I read, you know, you could do a lot with someone like that. So honestly, I think you can really do something with any president. The issue would be, would people buy a book about Chester Arthur? You know, would they do that? Maybe, I don't know. But I think, you know, certainly FDR would be someone that people would definitely want to read about. So I guess there's a lot of considerations there. But for now, I'm kind of focused on the early ones and then kind of see where we go.
Great, thank you. And I have one from Marvin. It says, Debbie, I once asked you this question. You present many wonderful young characters in all your books. In this book about Jefferson, who is your favorite young person, the one you would really like to meet?
Oh, that is a great question. My father always asks great questions. Okay, so that gets to the question of Oliver. Oliver was a difficult character for me to get into. In the first book, Oliver comes across as actually very annoying. I mean, Sam finds Oliver incredibly frustrating to deal with and incredibly annoying. And I was like, when I realized that the third book had to be about Oliver, I was like, why am I writing about Oliver? He's not that likable. He's not, you know, how do I get into his head? And I spent a lot of time thinking about Oliver and how to approach Oliver and how to like bond with Oliver. But actually, I came to be so fond of Oliver. I mean, he is, I love Oliver. I mean, I love Sam and I love Ava. I love all my characters, but I was very, very fond of Oliver as I wrote about him. It just took a while, you know? But, and I hope that everyone will be fond of him too. Reads the book. But it was a lot more difficult than writing about Sam or Ava. I think Sam and Ava are easier to immediately like.
Great, thank you. Here's another one from Amanda Schwartz. We love your books. As you know, I wonder, how do you come up with the backstories, the everyday lives of the children you choose?
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. I think that with the first book, I had this idea of best friends who weren't speaking to each other anymore. And that was something that, you know, I think so many people have experienced that. And I remember going through that as a kid, and people just, you know, they remember these people that they used to be friends with and aren't anymore for whatever reason. It's just a really sort of crucial thing that happens. And then in Sam's case, this Andrew is his best friend from as far back as he can remember, and they end up just sort of drifting apart, and he feels terrible about it, and it's sort of something he thinks about throughout the book. With the second book, The Blended Family, I had already introduced Ava and her annoying younger stepbrother JP in book one, and I knew I'd be writing about Ava for book two. So that was sort of already built in, that I knew I'd be dealing with a blended family and all of the difficulties involved with that. And Oliver, you know, I had already said he was new. I had already sort of presented him and his personality, and that he's, everyone thinks he's a genius, but he doesn't have social skills. And he, you know, so that was already there, but I really got more into it. And, you know, the idea of being the new kid, you know, of having a hard time making friends, of trying to break in to this group of kids who have known each other for a long time when that is not your strong point, to try to become friends with people. So that a lot of the seeds for the second two books were already in book one, and I just took it and expanded on it.
Oh, great, thank you. I think we have time for two more questions, and I'm gonna direct this next one to Rob. This is from Martha. She asks, are there particular challenges in illustrating for children that don't come up in illustrating for a newspaper or for other audiences?
Well, I would say not really. The challenge to me here is doing these scene after scene after scene and trying to maintain really good character facial features from start to finish and different angles. And I mean, at the newspaper, I would draw a picture, but you know, when you end up with 15 pictures and 10 of them have the same character at a different pose or a different facial expression, that to me is the challenge here.
Got it, thank you. All right, so the last question, I think, this one is from Kem Sawyer. You probably knew a lot about Jefferson before you chose Jefferson as your subject. What surprised you the most once you decided to start the research for the book?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. That's a good question. I think that a lot of it involved little tidbits of information that I learned, and a lot of it was from books that I read. A lot of it was from the Monticello website and other websites. one example is that the Monticello website had this really interesting episode that they had information on involving Jefferson watching a solar eclipse in around 1811 with James Madison. And it was not entirely 100% clear that James Madison was there, but the Monticello people believed that he was, along with his private secretary. And I was like, I've got to put this in the book because, you know, you don't, like, one thing that's so interesting with Jefferson is his relationships with other figures of the time. Like, I mentioned John Adams before. They were the best of friends. They served together overseas and in the US or in the colonies before it was the US. They were such good friends. Abigail Adams was friends with him. And then politics drove them apart, which again is a timely thing with politics driving so many people apart today. They became bitter enemies. But then once they were both done with being president, they became friends again. They corresponded, and they both died on the 50th anniversary of the country, of this July 4th, 50 years later. You know, so I think that James Madison was another person that Jefferson had a very, very, very close bond with throughout. And I was doing a lot of research on Madison for our next project, and that carries through. I mean, and so I just love the idea of the two of them watching an eclipse together. You know, and Jefferson was so interested in science, and he had his telescope, his special telescope. And so it was really like these little pieces of information that kind of rounded out his character. I think one thing that I had not really thought about a lot also was when he was governor of Virginia during the Revolutionary War, the British were targeting him and he and his family fled. And I kind of knew that, but not in that much detail. And I read a lot about that because I definitely wanted to include that. So, so yeah, I mean, that's a wonderful question. And I think that it more sort of expanded my sense of him. And I think also the research I did on Madison Hemings was very enlightening as well.
Oh, that's great. Thank you to both Deborah and Rob. I think, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Thanks to the audience for joining us, and thanks so much for all the great questions. I wish we could, you know, keep going, but we're winding down. I did put the link to order the book into the chat. So please, you know, order a book if you haven't. You can always pick it up at the store or order it online later on as well. And again, thank you all for joining us tonight. We really enjoyed this conversation. Stay tuned and keep watching for upcoming events like this. You can check out the Politics and Prose website calendar. There's new events being added every day. Then I just want to say good night to everyone. Stay safe and keep reading, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.